Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is John Quincy Adams, Part 1. John Quincy Adams was the sixth President of the United States of America. Fascinating fellow. Very interesting. He had just an amazing life. His father was the second President of the United States, John Adams. Actually, there was a lot of pressure placed on him, but he did his best, although he always felt it wasn't enough. When he was 10 years old in 1778, he went with his father, John Adams, to Europe. Remember, his father was the leader in promoting American independence, and then he was sent to Europe to try to get French support in the American Revolution and Dutch loans. So it was decided that John Quincy would go with his father, or Johnny as they called him, because his dad had been gone a lot when he was young. His dad had been off in Philadelphia in the Continental Congress, and it was decided that he was old enough and he should be with his father, and he could get his schooling in Europe. He spent many years in Europe, I believe about 18 years, and this was the beginning of that. Much of his childhood was spent in Europe, and this time, the early time, in France and the Netherlands. When he was 14, he went as the secretary of Francis Dana, the first U.S. ambassador to Russia. So he was only 14. He did that because he could speak French, and so that was another. He spent actually a fair number of years in Russia. His wife Louisa was born in England. Her parents were American, and she's the only foreign-born first lady. John Quincy Adams was the first president inaugurated wearing pants and not breeches. Breeches don't go all the way to your ankle. The styles always change. As president, he installed a billiards table and a chessboard in the White House. He was known for his early morning naked swims across the Potomac River in Washington City, and in his latter years. At age 58, he swam across the Potomac in 1 hour. He's the only former president after he served in the White House to serve in the House of Representatives. He was the lawyer for the slaves in the famous Amistad case in 1841, which he won. He's the only president elected with fewer electoral votes and fewer popular votes than his opponent, Andrew Jackson, in the 1824 election. He's considered the most outspoken opponent of slavery, and this was in his final years. He had 2 brothers and 2 sons, and all 4 of them died of alcoholism, so he had a lot of tragedy in his life, very tragic. He also suffered from depression, some debilitating depression, but he fought it. He fought it through activity and through trying to achieve things. One of his finest biographers, in my opinion, Harlow Giles Unger, wrote this about John Quincy Adams, quote, "He served under Washington and with Lincoln. He lived with Ben Franklin, lunched with Lafayette, Jefferson, and Wellington. He walked with Russia's Tsar and talked with Britain's king. He dined with Charles Dickens, taught at Harvard, and was American minister to 6 European countries. He negotiated the peace that ended the War of 1812, freed the African prisoners on the slave ship Amistad, served 16 years in the House of Representatives, restored free speech in Congress, and led the anti-slavery movement. He was the 6th President of the United States. John Quincy Adams was all these things and more." John Quincy Adams was born on July 11th, 1767, in Braintree, later renamed Quincy, Massachusetts. In 1775, when he was 8 years old, he watched the Battle of Bunker Hill with his mother from the top of Penn's Hill above the family farm. As a boy, he learned to ride a horse, hunt, and shoot a musket, and he enjoyed swimming in Black's Creek. At that Battle of Bunker Hill, Joseph Warren was the family doctor, and he died at that battle. That was the first major battle in the American Revolution. George Washington was on his way to take command of the Continental Army. Now, this Dr. Warren, earlier, before the battle, he was the family doctor. He had John Quincy, had badly broken a forefinger, and it was feared that it would need to be amputated. However, Dr. Warren saved his finger, and he really needed that for all the writing. This must have been in his right hand, all the writing that he did in his life. So, and then this Dr. Warren died at Bunker Hill. John Quincy Adams recalled his childhood years later, and he wrote this, quote, "At 10 years of age, I read Shakespeare's Tempest, As You Like It, Merry Wives of Windsor, Much Ado About Nothing, and King Lear. There was also a small edition of Milton's Paradise Lost, which I believe I attempted 10 times to read, and never could get through half the book. I was mortified, even to the shedding of tears, that I could not even conceive what it was that my father and mother admired so much in that book, and yet I was ashamed to ask. I was ashamed to ask them an explanation. I smoked tobacco and read Milton at the same time, from the same motive, to find out what was the recondite charm in them which gave my father so much pleasure. After making myself 4 or 5 times sick with smoking, I mastered that accomplishment, but did not master Milton. I was 30 when I first read Paradise Lost with delight and astonishment." Now, in his childhood, he was under a lot of pressure from his parents to achieve, to study, and that's how they expected great things of him, and he did achieve a lot, although his 2 brothers collapsed under the pressure from their parents. So at age 10, he went with his father to Europe during the American Revolution. It was a dangerous trip across the Atlantic Ocean because the British could have stopped the ship and would have captured them all. And his father had this very important role in trying to get France to support the U.S. and the American Revolution. Now, John Quincy, was in school. He went to a boarding school in France in Passy, which I believe is near Paris. He was mature for a young age. He really sort of accepted this all this responsibility, the expectations that were placed on him. He wrote a letter from Paris, from France, to his brother Charles, and he said this, quote, "We are sent into this world for some end. It is our duty to discover by close study what this end is, and when we once discover it, to pursue it with unconquerable perseverance." So, he had determination, even at a young age. So in 1779, after a year and a half, father and son, John Quincy, returned to the United States. But only 4 months later, his father was sent back to Europe to negotiate an end to the War of Independence. And this time they stayed 6 years. And so in November of 1779, they returned, and Charles, his younger brother, age 9, also came with them for the same reason. And his father was trying to negotiate a peace treaty with Great Britain. They had trouble on the trip. They landed because of the weather, they landed in Spain, and it was decided they couldn't get another boat up closer to Paris, France. So they decided to travel overland through Spain, and it was a tough trip. And John Quincy, who actually kept a lifelong diary, wonderful resource for historians, he wrote this about traveling through Spain in 1779. "I thank Almighty God that I was born in a country where anybody may make a good living if they please." He was referring to the Spanish poverty, severe poverty in Spain, even though they had a tremendous empire, but it certainly wasn't enriching. The common people of Spain did not benefit from the empire, only individuals. After a tough trip, John Adams and his 2 sons arrived in Paris, and Johnny and Charles were enrolled in the school in Passy. Johnny was studying Latin, Greek, French, geometry, arithmetic, writing, and drawing. And then in July, John Adams decided to travel to Holland. He's trying to get Dutch loans. The U.S. needed loans to fight the war. And so the father and the 2 sons moved to Amsterdam, Holland. Both boys were enrolled in the Latin school, but they're very unhappy there, and they changed schools, transferred to the school in Leiden. By 1781, U.S. sent its first ambassador to Russia, Francis Dana, and he did not speak French, which was the language of diplomacy in Europe. But Johnny had learned French, and he was young, so it's easier for kids to learn languages. So it was decided that he would go accompany Francis Dana as his secretary. He was only 14, and he spent 2 years in Russia. Now, meanwhile, his younger brother Charles was very unhappy in Europe, and he was sent home to Massachusetts. So anyway, this was a real adventure, and he was left. His father remained in Holland, Holland and France. So it was Catherine the Great was the Tsarina of Russia at that time, one of the greatest leaders in Russian history, and she was actually German. And it was a tough trip. It took 55 days, 2,500-mile journey. They passed through Utrecht in Germany, Cologne, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Berlin, Danzig, Riga in Latvia, and finally in St. Petersburg, which was the capital at that time, not Moscow. The common people of Russian were called serfs, and they were like slaves. It's very troubling. There were no schools, so Johnny had to have self-study. He couldn't. He had to just read books on his own, and he definitely was homesick in St. Petersburg. Another fine biographer, a tremendous biography of John Quincy Adams, was Paul C. Nagel, and he wrote this about John Quincy in St. Petersburg at that time when he was 14. Quote, "John Quincy Adams haunted the booksellers, the start of a lifelong hobby, buying many volumes for shipment home. He began to study German and became such a master of French that John Adams half seriously complained that his son wrote better letters in French than in English." Yeah, so he wasn't lollygagging. He was taking advantage of there were books to be had in St. Petersburg, and lifelong. I'm inspired by him. He was an intellectual, though he also had a fighting spirit, John Quincy Adams, but he was definitely loved reading books. He really lifelong lover of learning. Harlow Giles Unger wrote about John Quincy's experience in Russia. Quote, "The crushing poverty, deprivation, and lack of freedom in Russian life and the oppressive slavery he had witnessed left him depressed." And John Quincy wrote, quote, "Everyone that is not noble is a slave." So a different world in Russia. And so he was there for about a year and a half, and then his father called him to come to him in the Netherlands. So Johnny left St. Petersburg in October of 1782, and took him about 6 months to make it. Travel was pretty slow back then. He traveled through Finland and into Sweden, and he wrote this about Sweden, quote, "Sweden is the country in Europe which pleases me most." Traveled through Denmark, Hamburg, and finally arrived at The Hague in April of 1783. 6-month trip, although he actually took his time. He really had come of age. He was a young man, a man of the world. He was traveling on his own, and he really enjoying himself, really enjoying these different countries and different peoples of Europe. And so he was back with his father again, in 1783 his father was in England, and in October they visited Bedlam, the hospital for the insane. And that must be where the word Bedlam comes from, sort of a craziness. By 1783, John Quincy was working as a secretary at the Paris peace talks to end the war between the United States and Great Britain, the War of Independence for the 13 North American English colonies. In 1784, his father they both were driven men, driven to achieve, tended to overwork, and his father had some severe health problems in Holland, but he recovered. And biographer Paul C. Nagel wrote this, quote, "Soon John's health had improved dramatically, allowing the Adamses to have a wonderful time together, particularly as they read Plutarch aloud over coffee and chocolate at breakfast. During these early months in 1784, Johnny was lost to his delicious revel in books, travel, theater, and the arts. I especially enjoyed that reference to Plutarch, who's considered like this great biography from ancient Rome. Paul C. Nagel wrote this about this time, quote, now, sometime later they ended up in Paris, France, the father and son, and Paul C. Nagel wrote this, quote, amid the gratifications of these last weeks in Paris, Johnny found time to resume his diary. He opened the first volume with a quotation from Voltaire. Indolence is sweet, and its consequence is bitter. A sentiment he would repeat in 100 variations over the years. I think part of the reason he had this depression, he felt this compulsion to achieve. He always felt whatever he did wasn't good enough. And so he pushed himself, though he also had good times. Whenever he was having a good time, which people, we need recreation, but he kind of felt like he was being lazy. Now, since John and John Quincy, the father and son, they hadn't seen John hadn't seen his wife. They've been separated from Abigail and then the sister, Nabby. So it was decided that Abigail and Nabby Adams would come to them. And that's what happened. They sailed for Europe. And John Quincy was at The Hague studying. They had a August reunion in London. John and John Quincy, husband and wife, and the two siblings. So they had a nice family reunion there. Abigail was pretty hard on John Quincy. She was always writing him letters, and encouraging him to work very, very hard. In August, the four of them were in Paris, and his father, by then the war was over. The American Revolution had been won, but John Adams was negotiating peace treaties with European countries. And his companion was Thomas Jefferson, who was also there for the same reason. And during this time, John Quincy and Thomas Jefferson became very good friends, very close with each other. Now, he was 18 in 1785, and it was decided that he needed to return to America. He'd been gone for quite a few years. He'd been gone. He left when he'd been gone for about 8 years, really, close to 8 years. And so, 7 years in Europe. He'd been in Amsterdam, The Hague, St. Petersburg, and Paris. So it was decided he needed to come back to America to go to college. His father had gone to Harvard, and they were hoping that he would be admitted there as well. So he came home after all these years in Europe, so much of his childhood in Europe. He arrived in New York City, and he was the son of the famous John Adams, and that gave him standing. He met some famous people. He met Thomas Paine, the author of The Crisis, and Common Sense, who had played a major role in the American Revolution through his writing. He also met James Monroe, who later would become president, and under whom he would serve as Secretary of State, and other famous politicians. By August, he was in Boston preparing for entrance at Harvard. Initially, he was not accepted. The powers that be thought, no, you're not up to snuff. So he had to study some more, but eventually, after a number of months, he was accepted. And after studying for some time, he studied Virgil, Horace, Homer, Xenophon, Greek grammar, the Greek New Testament, geography, logic, and the writing of John Locke. So during this time, he wasn't studying all the time. And Paul C. Nagel wrote this about this time in his life. When he was in the Boston area. And Nagel wrote this quote, "Young ladies and gentlemen of Haverhill," now that's in Massachusetts, "were often together without the presence of elders. Couples huddled during the long sleighing expeditions. Although, as John Quincy Adams recalled with amusement years later, these excursions were necessarily chaste, since the participants had to be heavily clad against the cold." By 1786, John Quincy was admitted to Harvard and began his college days. He paid no tuition. It was waived because of his father's national service. So that was pretty nice. He got very interested in astronomy, very hard worker, and he graduated in a year and a half. He was admitted as a junior, They decided that, he'd really learned a lot, and even strangely enough, they didn't accept him earlier, although I think they were hoping for this, junior year admission. So he only had a year and a half at Harvard. Kind of too bad, because he really enjoyed being there, loved studying, and loved the whole college atmosphere. And he was given credit for his European studies. By 1787, John Quincy graduated from Harvard. And, of course, the next question was, what was he going to do with his life? And his father, encouraged him and pressured him to become a lawyer, even though it really wasn't what he wanted to do. But, he had to do something, so he began a 3-year legal apprenticeship with lawyer Theophilus Parsons in Newburyport, Massachusetts. In September, he was 20 years old. Now, this was 40 miles northeast of Boston. He was working very hard. He really didn't like it at all. He actually hated his legal studies. He found it extremely boring, and the law really was not for him. So he had some depression during this time. He'd had some really very interesting years in Europe, very interesting and exciting. And now he was studying law and very, very unhappy at it. During that time, there was a big national debate about the U.S. Constitution, which had been signed but not ratified by the states. And John Quincy was of the opinion that he was in favor of the U.S. Constitution. And he did have time for recreation, and he continued to have time to read great books from the ancient Greeks and Romans and so forth, and from Europe, different countries in Europe. And after finishing at Harvard in 1787, he quoted Shakespeare's King Henry V, quote, "If it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive." So he was ambitious. He really wanted to be famous. He wanted to be recognized for achievement, and he was, despite his depression, or when he wasn't depressed, he had some good times around Newburyport and Haverhill, another community, and he wrote this in 1787, quote, "Dissipation is so fashionable here that it is necessary to enter into it a little in order not to appear too singular." Now, back then, the expression is singular, the adjective, that was not if you were a singular, that means you were kind of odd. Singular means one, so that means you weren't really part of the group. So I thought that was a good quote. Again, he was very unhappy studying to be a lawyer, and he wrote this, quote, "God of heavens, if those are the only terms upon which life can be granted to me, oh, take me from this earth before I curse the day of my birth." In 1788, he was having trouble focusing on his studies. Yeah, part of it was his depression. And he wrote this quote, that he had been, quote, "somewhat in the dumps. I have in great measure gone into a course of dissipation. Balls, sleighing parties, and visiting occupy the whole of my time." I think he was exaggerating here. In 1789, his father took office as the first Vice President of the United States in April under U.S. President George Washington. The following year, John Quincy finally finished his legal studies and was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1790. He didn't have a lot of work. It takes time to develop a client base when you're a young lawyer. But he started writing. Started writing articles which were printed in newspapers in favor of the Federalist Party. And so this really was the beginning of his political career. And he was noticed. People took notice. This young John Quincy Adams. Especially, he was in favor of the Constitution and in favor of the policies of President George Washington. The following year, he was being supported by his parents because he wasn't making enough money. He had some legal work, but not a lot. So he spent his time. He had spare time in the office when there was no work to do, and he was reading these great authors that he enjoyed so much, including Livy, Tacitus, Cicero, Shakespeare, Milton, Pope, Jonathan Swift, Voltaire, Hume, Samuel Johnson, and Edmund Burke, among others. And he continued his political writing. You know, the French Revolution was a big topic. You know, did you favor it? Were you against it? And the Federalists were against the French Revolution. They didn't go for what was going on over there. And then this new party, the opposition party, the Republicans, later renamed Democrats, they were in favor of the French Revolution. So John Quincy was continuing to write, and he was getting into his legal career was not his future. The two great loves of his life were intellectuality and politics. And in politics, he was able to have enough time to read these intellectual books, great books. In 1791, there on Beacon Hill, John Quincy watched an eclipse of the sun. However, it wasn't safe. You know, it's not safe to look directly at an eclipse. And he watched without a piece of smoked glass for direct viewing. I guess the smoked glass would protect your eyes. So he looked directly. He hurt his eyes. His vision never quite recovered, and his eyes were a concern for the rest of his life. Reminded me of my childhood. There was an eclipse, and I think I did the same thing. I'm not sure, but I remember we were being warned, that you can't. I think we had to look at it through a piece of paper with a pinhole in it. Now there was an interesting thing going on in Boston, with cultural things. There was people who were against plays, plays where you have live actors. This is before TV and movies. But people would go and watch, actors perform plays for entertainment, telling a story. And there were those who thought, oh, this is immoral, it's terrible. So actually there was an anti-theater law which had been passed, which prohibited all plays. Now, John Quincy loved Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, of course, is very often has been performed as plays, and he wrote plays. And so he started writing articles, essays, which were published in the newspapers, which pressured the politician and played a role in ending the prohibition on plays. So this was a good thing, because this is what the people. There's nothing wrong with having plays. It's part of entertainment. In 1794, he got his big break when President George Washington appointed him as ambassador to the Netherlands. During this time, he was continuing to struggle as a lawyer, and so this was, he missed going to Europe. So this is his big chance to go back to Europe, which he enjoyed so much. He got the news in June of 1794, and in September sailed back to Europe. His younger brother Thomas came as his secretary. First, they spent some time in London and then traveled to The Hague in the Netherlands. So this was the beginning of his career as a diplomat. And for the next 7 years, he was in Europe, U.S. ambassador to several countries, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and Prussia. So he was pretty happy about this because as a diplomat, he did have time, along with his work, to engage in the thing that he enjoyed, which was reading great books of history and literature. Now, during this time, the Netherlands was under French occupation, under the Napoleonic Wars. The French gotten crazy. Well, this is a little bit before Napoleon, but during the time when France went to war with all the countries of Europe, exporting its revolution. He did not have much work to read. He did not have much work, so he had plenty of time to read. He wrote a letter during this time to his sister Nabby, who was back in Massachusetts, quote, "We are indeed once more scattered about the world, and our destiny from childhood has been that of wanderers beyond the common lot of men." During this time he was enjoying, he read Don Quixote's, or Cervantes' Don Quixote, one of my favorite books, and especially the story of tilting at windmills. And so he did not want to continue back and work as a lawyer again. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. We're out of time. Hope you find a good history book to read. Take care, and I'll see you next time.